Korea Exchanges and Cooperation Support Association. We are holding this Session 5-1, Implementation and Task of HDP Nexus for Humanitarian Aid, Development and Peace on the Korean Peninsula. And so I would like to welcome all of you. It has become a buzzword these days, the submission of DPRK's VNR. And according to this review, DPRK is stating that it is carrying out efforts to implement the 2030 agenda based on the 17 SDG targets. However, DPRK is faced with many difficulties. According to VNR, in the DPRK, 61% of its people has safe drinking water, and only 35% of its people receives energy supply and electricity supply. Due to continued natural disasters and sanctions against DPRK, their food production in 2018 was 4.95 million tons, and they are in lack of healthcare, human resources, and medication. Despite these difficulties, DPRK is trying to expand its international cooperation to achieve SDGs. And regarding DPRK's plans to be aligned with the strategies and standards of international society, we are trying to support them too. Although it seems that everything has come to a halt, we need to think about a sustainable North Korean development cooperation future, and that is why we are gathered here to speak about humanitarian aid, development cooperation, and peace. And we will be discussing the concept of HDP Nexus and the possibility of applying this with the international organizations and organizations that support aid to DPRK and researchers. We hope to pool the wisdom of all of the participants, and we ask for your active participation. Before we begin the presentation and discussions, I want to give some explanation to those watching via YouTube. On the bottom of the screen, you will see an explanation of how you can post your questions. During the presentations, you may post your questions through the link, and after the presentations, we will have a Q&A session based on the questions. We have 6 experts, and we have 3 Korean participants who are here at this location in Yeouido, Seoul. We have from SNU University, Tae-gyun Kim, Professor Tae-gyun Kim, and we have Director Hae-jung Lee from Korea Sharing Movement, and at the end we have Ji-sun Lee, Professor at Kyung University, as a discussant. And we have other speakers and discussants from 3 countries. First, for our presentation, we have our presenter, Jerome Savah, International Relations Consultant. Hello.
잘 들리세요?
Can you hear us, Jerome?
Thank you.
Thank you.
다음은 지금 스위스 제네바에 있을 겁니다. 아마
in Switzerland, Geneva.
전 스위스 개발협력청 북한 사무소 담당자이신 우리 카타리나 제레거님
We have Katerina
참석하셨습니다.
Geneva Gelweger from Korea Aid.
캐시 잘
Can
들리세요?
you hear us?
지금 화면이 멈춰 있는 것 같은데 뭐 계속 이어지도록 하겠습니다.
So we will go on.
핀란드 헬싱키죠. 헬싱키에 참석해 주셨습니다. 주시 오잘라,
we have
리필 처지 에이드
Jussi
고문님 참석하셨습니다.
Ozala from the Finn Church Aid.
예, 하이 주시. 예, 감사합니다.
Hello,
Thank you. I can hear you well.
예, 감사합니다. 저희가 주어진 시간이 1시간
We have
20분이죠.
1 hour
1시간
20
20분밖에
minutes
되지
for
않습니다.
this
그래서 좀
session.
좀 발표와 토론을 좀 부탁드리고요.
So we ask you to keep your presentations and your discussions short. We will give each of the presenters 20 minutes and for each of the discussants 10 minutes. And if we have time left, we will have a panel discussion and answer questions that have been posted online. So we will begin the presentation. We will be hearing about North Korea's SDG preparation and HDP Nexus-based platform connecting with human resources. And we will be hearing from Tae-gyun Kim, Professor of Seoul National University, and he participates in contributing to international aid works.
안녕하세요. 네,
Good
소개받은
afternoon.
서울대 국제대학원의
My name is
김태균이고요.
Kim
오늘 발표에
I'm a
앞서
professor
몇
at
가지,
Seoul National
물론 제가 이제
University.
20분 내에
Before I begin my
발표는 꼭 마치도록
presentation,
하겠습니다.
let me first tell you that
말씀드릴
I
것이
will be punctual.
있습니다. 뭐냐면
But
첫 번째는
anyways,
두 번째 발표하시는
allow me
그
to first,
연사님하고 제
share
주제가 많이
this.
겹치는 상황이 돼서
My
제가 두 번째
presentation will
발표를
overlap
받고 너무 잘 정리를
quite
하셔가지고 그걸
much
뒷받침할 수
with
있는
the
부분을
second
부각시킬 수 있는 그런
presenter.
내용들을 채웠습니다.
So I will be setting the scene for the second
그리고
presenter. I will
그
talk
세
about the
가지
background
영역, 특히
behind
HDP의 그
North
기반이
Korea's
될
VNR
SDG의 VNR
and
그리고 북한의 내부의
talk
그
about
국가
VNR
발전인데
as the basis
내셔널 데벨롭먼트
to
골이라고 하는
human
NDG
rights
그리고 마지막으로는
goals.
그
I
휴먼
will
라이츠
talk
아니
about
휴머니테리안
NDGs,
어시스턴스 기본이
the
될 수
national
있는
goals, and
일종의
I will
UPR에서
briefly
나온
touch
것들을 어떻게 우리가
upon
링크할 것인가
UPR
전략적으로
of
접근할 수
North
있는가에 대해서
Korea.
논의를 할
I will
예정이고요.
talk about
또
how we
하나는
can
마지막에 제가
strategically
다시 한번
approach
강조할 것 같은데
these different documents and
최종적으로는
reports.
SDG라는 것이 지금
And at the end of the day,
말씀하셨지만
as the moderator just
사실상
mentioned,
우리가 하이레벨 폴티컬 포럼에
SDG
뭐 4년에 한 번씩이라도
is
주기적으로
being
SDG를
reported to the high-level
의미를
political
제출하게 돼
forum,
있는데
and in part of
이게
that,
꼭한 나라만
countries have to
한
submit
나라의 계획을
VNR.
제출할 필요는 없는 걸로
But
제가 확인을 했었습니다.
it is my
UN
understanding
작년에
that
갔었는데요.
individual countries
그래서 중앙아시아 같은
are not
경우에는
required
공동의 문제가
to
있을
submit
경우에
a
그
VNR.
문제에 연결돼 있는
When it comes
국가들이
to
같이
problems
보고서를
that
나눌 수
connect
있다는
and relate to different countries, they can co-develop VNRs. So I think it is high time for the two Koreas to come up with a joint VNR. And my message here is that we need to work with North Korea to find the commonalities between VNR, NDG, and UPR, and work with North Korea as well as other neighboring countries to create a co-VNR. So that will be the message that I will deliver today. This is the content.
HDP Nexus는 뭐
I will skip this part. I'm sure that you know the concept of HDP Nexus, and I'm sure that Mr. Jerome will provide details about the HDP Nexus. But first, I would like to brief you about the risks that this approach entails. First is this. We have three concepts: humanitarian, development, and peace. And we can experience silos between the three areas because they used to exist as separate areas. And of course, we have to now identify where they intersect. And we need to come up with plans to converge these three different dimensions. But we don't have much documentation that can help us find an intersection between these three. Now, I would like to talk about the universality and particularities. When it comes to SDGs and UDP, they are global norms. And when we want to talk about those two in the regional context, it can lead to risks or it can create synergy. But not much discussion is made surrounding those topics. So we need to discuss in depth about how to work with those two concepts. And I'm sure that Jerome will provide us great insight into this. So we have on one side universal norms, including SDGs or UPR or VNR. It can take various forms. And on the other side, we have the particularity of North Korea. Of course, we are one community, we are one people, but the way we communicate with North Korea gives us the premise that we have to understand what's going on in North Korea. However, it's been some time that North Korea has been abiding by the global standard, which led to VNR and UPR as well as other documents. We understand that. However, at the same time, we need to come up with a universal norm together. Then what about the particularity of South Korea? If we were to find and identify the intersection, the triple nexus between humanitarian development and peace, what South Korea can do. once we overlap these three dimensions, Korea needs to be bold in its decision to develop SDGs tailored to the Korean Peninsula. So the framework that I would to provide you today is this. So of course, particularity and universality all matters, and VNR and UPR and NDG, they all matter in finding the intersection between these different norms. And now today I will present the 5-year plan of North Korea, and we should be aligned to what North Korea has presented to find this commonality and common area. Now, of course, we have this at the regional level. All the UN member countries will have SDGs and create VNRs. That means they need to report on how they plan to implement SDGs based on their NDGs. So they will adjust the targets and tailor all the SDG targets to their own specific needs. So including North Korea and South Korea, all countries have different circumstances, be it environment or society, and they need to reinterpret SDGs based on their circumstances, and North Korea did that exactly. Then how do we align that to SDGs? And that's the question. And Nodong Shinmun as well as other channels of communication are being used in North Korea to communicate their goals. Now, moving on to UPR, this is linked to peace. So to talk about HDP Nexus, we have to talk about UPR. This is a topic that we need to address, and I'm sure that Jerome will talk about UPR in his presentation. So I will be brief, and I think that Jerome can provide us the details of this. Next, this is DPRK's VNR of 2021. As you know, this was submitted in July, and in fact, North Korea wanted to submit this last year, but they had to postpone it 1 year because of the virus. And they've been working on this since 2020, and their party keeps saying that they have been working on this from a long time ago, but in 2018, they kind of reached consensus to come up with this report. And they received help from the UN to learn about statistics, about the indicators, and they were trained about the international norms and standards. So they received 4 times of training. So we can learn that North Korea did their best to learn what the international community requires them to do. But what matters here is that, of course, they are working to fit to the global standards, and I believe that they will continue on to do so. But then what strategy should we take in that context? I think the answer is pretty clear. Now, I'm sure that you can read the report, so I will skip this. But what matters here is that SDG and VNR should be connected, and ownership is a key terminology that North Korea uses, and it is part of the Paris Convention as well as other key conventions. So they will not stick to the international norms without conditions. They will base it on their tailored conditions. So they talk about governance and rule of accountability and so forth, and these are quite sensitive. So 16 is a very sensitive target. What they are saying here is they will consolidate their regime. So this is something that they want to do going forward. They say consolidate the socialist system. So there are a few that really shows North Korea's true color, and I will talk about that later on. And I'm not sure that you can see this. This is a busy slide, But what we have here in blue is the reinterpretation done by North Korea. 1.4, so I can't really read here. Number 8, these were reinterpreted by the North Korean regime to consolidate the socialist system. At the same time, they emphasize Juche ideology on the basis of education. They also use civilized life. They also talk about infrastructure in relation to Juche ideology, and they want to nurture talent based on their ideology as well. So science, technology, energy, and intelligence are some of the keywords that North Korea uses. So they want to provide all people training and education under their Juche ideology. So their 5-year NDG is quite aligned to this. Now let us look into the details. This is NDG and SDG, how these two are linked. This is part of the VNR report that North Korea submitted. So you can have a look the connection between the two. It talks about the people's government and people first principle. That's their first goal. So NDG1 is strengthen the people's government and display the people first principle. And under that, it sets forth number 4, 9, and 16. It talks about put national economy on a Juche and modern basis and modernize infrastructure. And number 16 can be a sensitive target for developing countries and also to North Korea because it can challenge the North Korean regime, which is why North Korea changed the words and says consolidate the socialist system. And the rest of the targets you can have a look on your own. So what I want to say here is that SDGs and national development goals are interlinked, and they are interlinked at a very high level. And if we were to reinterpret that from the perspective of UPR, then we can drill down to a few ideas, and that can have implications on the Korean Peninsula. And Korea can start off with what this shows us and what this implies to us. That should be our first step. And then we can move on to the next step. Then not only North Korea but the international community could work together. So this is a brief summary of UPR. It has two parts. So there was 2019 and 2014. So first of all, North Korea is very accepting to 199, and they are not accepting to about 63 recommendations. So out of the 199 recommendations that North Korea is willing to review and support, we have to look where these provisions interlink with the VNR and SDGs. Now let us look at the purple lines here. So what the UPR suggests is that the national development goals should be supported by the North Korean regime. Pyongyang has its own national goals and it should be followed through. And the national goals set forth by the regime should be legitimized. And there are two ways to do so. The first is SDG, the other one is UPR. So it also talks about SDGs. If you look at the second purple line, it says promote the health and well-being of the public in line with the SDGs. And now moving on, it talks about health, education, and food. So at the end of the day, what North Korea is trying to do in alignment with UPR is not related to citizens' rights, but about the right to economy and culture. And these are the 63 recommendations that North Korea is refusing to support immediately about political prisoners as well as about torture and the right to citizenship and so forth. So this is a summary and the key findings. If we look at the dimensions of politics, society, and culture, what the international community asks North Korea to do and what North Korea is willing to do has discrepancy. And we will, therefore, we will have to identify some areas to work together. So we have this international norm on one side, and on the other side, we have what the North Korea wants to achieve. And it will not be easy to find commonalities between the two, which is why we have to accept the fact that it might not be easy to cooperate with North Korea. When it comes to economy, culture, and society, maybe those should be the dimensions that we need to tap into first. So I think this is pretty much self-explanatory. You can read it on your own. I think North Korea wants to pursue multilateralism. Before it was with Soviet Union or with China, so it was focused on bilateral relations. However, I think North Korea wants to move beyond that. Of course, one-on-one relations matter, but from 2011, 노동신문 starts to talk about multilateralism. And we can analyze a rich content of multilateralism dealt with by the newspaper. And they understand that international affairs is quite important to their regime. And number one to that, the number one stepping stone to that would be SDG. And I'm sure that that was the thinking behind North Korea's submission of VNR. Now, I'm concerned about HDP Nexus peace dimension. Of course, when it comes to humanitarian aid, well, North Korea said we will no longer receive assistance from others. We want a development cooperation. So I talked about the intersection between humanitarian development and peace, and we need to identify where they overlap. If once peace comes in to play, then what would be the definition of peace here? Is it peace defined by the international community or peace defined by the regime itself? So how are we going to approach peace? Is it negative peace or positive peace? And of course, that was the definition of Khartoum, but we need to extend the discussions so that we maybe reach this conclusion. So development will be on top and its share will be the largest, and peace is somewhat lost. So the nexus will be driven by development, and I believe that this is what North Korea wants. Then how is South Korea going to respond to this? With that, I would like to wrap up my presentation. Yes, thank you very much. So you finished your presentation 2 minutes early, so thank you very much for that. And I think you raised great questions about what the Korean Peninsula should do in aligning with the SDGs. What would be the 18th goal? How can the two Koreas cooperate? Is it in the field of development? And what can we do to achieve sustainable development to bring peace on the Korean Peninsula? So is it SDG from the development perspective? No, it should be led by the two Koreas in that sense. So we need a new SDG that is tailored to our conditions. Next, the next presenter, I think it's 1 a.m. there, and we are always grateful to you. I think it was 2019, for 5 years, you were in Pyongyang.
And
you played a great role in coordinating with the Korean NGOs and the DPRK, Jerome Sauvage, and he will be speaking about his 5 years experience as the UN coordinator in the DPRK, and he worked very hard for aid, to provide aid in the DPRK. You may start.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kang. I hope everyone can hear me. It is nice to see old friends from Korea sharing movement and elsewhere. My job tonight is to pick up from Professor Kim, Taekyung Kim, on the theoretical framework of humanitarian development, peace, nexus. How does it apply? How could it apply to the North Korean context? I have worked for 3.5 years as the UN resident coordinator in North Korea. And I will try to speak from the perspective of the practical implementation of this new, or perhaps not so new concept. DPRK is not a perfect fit for let me give you 1 minute. DPRK is not a perfect fit for the humanitarian development peace nexus. Why? Because often we apply HDP Nexus to what we call failed states, where there is a conflict in the country. North Korea is not a failed state, mired in conflict. It is not. It performs fundamental functions of any state, projects authority over its territory, border, and peoples. There is no domestic conflict requiring traditional peace-building interventions involving peace actors. There are no refugees inside the country, as often the peace element of the HDP is considered. But the concept of HDP offers useful answers to the recurring aspects of the North Korean crises. North Korea shares some features of fragile states. It is not able to fully meet the needs of the citizens. Food and health security needs are not fully met. North Korea struggles to prevent recurring natural disasters and their worst effects. The humanitarian situation in DPRK is that of a protracted crisis with structural causes. The context is, after all, a context of conflict, although it is regional conflict, not domestic. Humanitarian aid is insufficient. It needs development and peace. So yes, linking thinking that makes actors link and integrate the humanitarian development and peace action is necessary. My job is to talk about the 5 tools of UN coordination in North Korea as they apply that HDP nexus: the UN country team, the UN strategic framework, the sustainable development goals, the universal periodic review, and human rights upfront. I want to talk about it quickly. The UN country team in North Korea comprises resident and non-resident agencies in North Korea with humanitarian and development mandates. It coordinates the humanitarian and development aid with all the national and international actors, both in North Korea and outside. The UN resident coordinator leads the UN country team, reports to the UN Secretary General, and corresponds with UN agencies with human rights and peace mandates. The UN country team communicates on North Korea with key UN member countries: China, Russia, USA, South Korea, Japan, European Union, and Switzerland, which plays an important role in North Korea. UN country team has not fully achieved its potential for coordination internally and externally, especially in the peace mandate. It is not a fully achieved mandate. The second tool is the UN strategic framework in North Korea. It describes the UN's collective actions in the DPRK at the strategic level, shares and transfers international principles and values, standards and know-how, integrates development, humanitarian, and equity considerations. The UNSF links the thinking between development, the international norms and standards that Professor Kim has talked about, resilience at all levels of DPRK society in order to reduce the humanitarian needs in the future. The UNSF incorporates all the sustainable development goals that Professor Kim has described. Right now, the UNSF in DPRK follows the first UNSF that I had started. Third tool, global SDGs. Professor Kim has spoke about the global SDGs already quite a bit. It is a framework for coordination. The coordinating nature of SDGs is integration, coherence, alignment. SDGs integrate the humanitarian to development continuum through the goals of resilience, sustainability. SDGs integrate the peace element, and that's new, through the goals of equity, justice, inclusivity, and peace. DPRK has localized the SDGs that Professor Kim has explained to accord with their specific situations. It's called the NDGs, National Development Goals. And the UN has taken these goals and put them in their program. For example, SDG 5, achieve gender equality. NDG, National Development Goal, consolidate gender equality and rights of all women and girls. And program, UN and DPRK government will review the situation of gender equality in DPRK and assess every UN project through a gender lens. Another example, SDGs and the HDP Nexus, is resilience. On the left side of my presentation, you see the SDG 7, ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. The National Development Goal of North Korea, ensure access to sustainable and modern energy. And on the right, UN Strategic Framework, the program, local communities, especially those most vulnerable, have access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy. And the same down below, I will not describe it all, for SDG 11, another NDG of North Korea, and another program plan for the UN Strategic Framework dealing with disasters and climate change. And finally, like Professor Kim has said, peace. DPRK has accepted SDG 16, which links for the first time development, peace, justice, and good governance. So the NDG 1, NDG of North Korea, is called Strengthen the People's Government and Display the People First principle. The SDG 16 is Promote Societies for Sustainable Development, provide access to justice for all, and build accountable and inclusive institutions. Now, if you want to go down to the lower part of the table, the goal of the UN Strategic Framework are human rights-based approach in formulation and implementation of each of the programs and projects undertaken by the UN in DPR Korea, including especially in the targeting of beneficiaries to address any inequalities and to reach the most vulnerable people, groups, and regions of the country. And secondly, the UN support to the government in implementing its commitments under a variety of human rights conventions and processes. So that's the link, SDG for peace, NDG, and UN Strategic Framework. Professor Kim has spoken about the voluntary national review on the SDGs. I would say that it is not yet at international standards, the quality of the reporting of this one that was done in June 2021 to the UN. There are inconsistencies in targets and indicators due to incomplete national data that make international comparisons difficult. The report is too focused on achievements and not enough on the targets lagging behind, why they're lagging behind, and what is being done to put them on track. For example, the reporting on the National Disaster Reduction Strategy. On page 40, the VNR says the implementation of the National Disaster Risk Reduction Strategy and the local disaster reduction plans is off track. And then on page 64, it says proportion of local disaster risk reduction plan adopted in line with national strategy, 0% in 2015, 0% in 2018, 100% in 2020. It's not very realistic sometimes, but it is a first step. SDG reporting is difficult to accomplish. It requires actually some courage by the government officials in North Korea who are doing it. First, the lack of data is tremendous in North Korea. There is poor coordination between national agencies. There is poor reporting from provincial level to central level. There is a lack of practice in transparency. Policy making, the word policy making, usually belongs only to the leader, the great leader, so to speak. And finally, there are political obstacles. The government officials who issue the VNR have to have intense negotiations with other centers of power, like the party, the military, or the security system. The tool number 4 is the Universal Periodic Review, which is whereby the United Nations promotes the protection of human rights on the ground by assessing the state's human rights records and violation. Like Professor Tae-Kyung Kim has said, the last one was in May 2019 and produced 262 recommendations. I would just say, because Professor Kim has spoken very eloquently about the UPR, I would say that the UPR shows that the DPRK wants to remain engaged with and stay a member of the international community. After the second UPR, DPRK took some actions. They created some institutions, they did a few actions. Professor Tae-Young Kim has listed them in his presentation. Please see it. But the DPRK has accepted to dialogue with UN bodies and the UN resident coordinator to improve the human rights situation in the country, and with the humanitarian agencies to ensure their free and unimpeded access to all populations in need, so that humanitarian aid is distributed transparently and reaches the most vulnerable citizens. So I would say that UPR is an opening for discussion. And the discussion is, what do you mean by all populations in need or most vulnerable citizens? Is it street children, homeless people, elderly and disabled persons, persons held in detention centers or prison labor camps? It is a basis for discussion. How should international organizations reach these persons? And finally, the last tool I would like to mention, it is less well known. It is called Human Rights Upfront Strategy. Former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon introduced HRUF to better coordinate between UN agencies, separate approaches, the silo that Professor Kim talks about, separate approaches to development, peace and security, and human rights. At present in DPRK, there is a human rights-based approach in programming. You try to think about the human rights dimension as you do your programming. The UN supports the DPRK commitments under the UN human rights treaties, International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, International Convention on the Rights of the Child, International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. It is a first step again, but it is not yet fully achieved to completely include the human rights goal in the UN strategic framework for North Korea. Can the HDP Nexus approach have a positive impact on North Korea? It has increased the focus on resilience, disaster preparedness and prevention. There is more renewable energy projects for the population, solar, hydropower, etc. Greater attention to inclusivity, disadvantaged groups and regions, women and girls, disabled persons. There is a greater population engagement and improvement on the data. But the obstacles to an HDP approach in North Korea are political. we have discussed already national obstacle, but also international. Too often is the quid pro quo between denuclearization versus assistance. That limits our engagement. The UN agencies are too limited to humanitarian aid. And there is a rejection of, like Professor Kim has said, capacity building or transfer of technology that is sometimes too extreme from the international community. So, opportunity for humanitarian development peace nexus after COVID? Yes, maybe. But first, we have to accept the extreme self-isolation under COVID, which is like a natural disaster. The UN did not issue an appeal for 2021. There's a fear of the worsening humanitarian situation in North Korea. But yes, there should be an opportunity for renewed dialogue with countries and region and the USA, and an opportunity to push forward with the humanitarian development peace nexus approach. Thank you very much.
예, 미스터 제롬 대단히 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for the
외국인,
presentation.
한민족이 아닌
Jerome.
외국인 중에서 북한의 상황을
So
가장
I
잘
think
아는
you must be the
말씀드리겠습니다.
experts that knows the best about North Korea, other than experts from Korea. So Jerome talked about peace. So no matter what the position of North Korea is, we have to understand the situation well and use SDG to make it conflict-free. At the same time, from the North and South perspective, of course, we are not confronted with military threat, but still we are in confrontation. Given that, how are we going to bring peace and contribute to peace? And I think that message was quite intertwined with what Professor Kim mentioned. And as Professor Kim mentioned, and as Mr. Jerome mentioned, how are we going to secure resilience and inclusiveness towards North Korea? In that sense, we need cooperation and development with North Korea. 3 years ago, the two leaders from North and South agreed for development, and that development in North Korea will contribute to bringing peace on the Korean Peninsula. And I think what the professor and Jerome mentioned are very much aligned to that agreement. And while given the circumstances in North Korea, the regime will not be able to abide by SDG fully. However, will the regime still try to attain SDG to some degree? Well, we have to discuss on that. Thank you very much for your presentations. Next, moving on to the discussants. We have with us Ms. Lee Ye-jung from Korean Sharing Movement. And she worked for another organization for 2 years. She was actually one of the officers dedicated to Pyongyang's Kaesong complex. So she will have much to offer us based on her extensive experience. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lee Ye-jung from Korean Sharing Movement. So the hotline is still alive. It's just the office that was bombed by North Korea. Anyways, so to start the discussion, it seems only right to examine the present level of humanitarian aid and development cooperation to North Korea. So to tell you the conclusion first, since we started aid to North Korea back in 1995, all the aids were humanitarian aid, and Professor Kim said that back in 2004, North Korea wanted a transition into development programs. However, even after that, humanitarian aid has been given to North Korea. Of course, the characteristics of the North Korea assistance programs changed. So before it was about supplying goods,
and help to North Korea, but the type of projects are changed. So it's more of development projects. Then how are we going to guarantee sustainable growth? Technological and technical transfer were part of the aid that were provided to North Korea. However, can we call them development programs? So I'm not an expert in this, so I think that Professor Kim will have much to say, but most of the time when we talk about development programs, it's mostly the financial institutions that provide such aid. In that sense, as you know, North Korea is not qualified to receive aid from such financial institutions, and they cannot receive such assistance. And if we look at the large-scale projects that have been carried out so far, it was mostly humanitarian than development because of the immediate needs of the regime. And as Jerome mentioned, most of the programs that are provided to North Korea are humanitarian in its essence. So now the EU does provide aid to North Korea, but not development assistance. So in conclusion, I think it would be more accurate to say that North Korea is at the moment a country that seeks development cooperation, but finds itself at the mercy of humanitarian aid. And this trend has been further reinforced by the tightened sanctions on North Korea since 2017. So we have been working hard to make us more approachable to North Korea. SDG and other programs were some of the examples as mentioned by the professor and Jerome. So VNR is a good case in point that we can look at. However, as pointed out by many people, VNR has its limitations, but still, I think it itself is quite meaningful that North Korea has given an account of its situation in terms of global development goals. But given climate change or the environment or disaster reduction, these are areas that require international cooperation, and North Korea keeps mentioning the importance of such international cooperation. So we should take a look at that. And if North Korea is more sincere with its commitment, and if the conditions are set, I think that North Korea is actually one of the favorable regimes to provide aid to. So there was this one person who worked with the North Korean regime who said this. So from the outside, North Korea looks quite unstable, but turned out to be one of the safest countries to carry out humanitarian aid projects. So this was the words of a working level staff in an American aid organization. So there is no way for North Koreans to steal the supplies and people receive aid in an orderly manner. So I think that shows that North Korea is a good recipient of aid. Of course, the article also criticizes the North Korean regime where everything is tightly controlled. However, in terms of aid projects, any project can be carried out quickly and successfully only if North Korea stays on board. So if we can keep North Korea on board, I think that it will be a good recipient of aid and assistance. And Professor Kim talked about ownership, and to the best of my knowledge, in development and humanitarian aid, national ownership is a key concept. So when the recipient takes solid ownership, then the programs are more likely to lead to success according to research. And North Korea shows a lot of ownership. When we think of North Korea, we tend to see them with some skepticism. But in terms of implementation, I think that what North Korea has to offer can be helpful to providing assistance, but it needs to create a more engaging system, and it has to increase the level of participation from the regime to individuals. So it needs to take a more bottom-up approach going forward. So that's a task that North Korea faces. But as I mentioned earlier, the international community allows humanitarian aid to North Korea, but not development cooperation. And as long as no visible change is made with respect to the North Korean nuclear issue, this trend is likely to continue. And I believe that unless this trend is changed, the HDP discussion related to North Korea will make no progress. Therefore, it seems necessary to change the current environment surrounding North Korea, and I believe that one axis that leads to change is peace. And Professor Kim and Jerome both mentioned that it will not be easy to deal with peace when dealing with North Korea. I'm not a researcher, I'm a practitioner, I'm an activist, so based on my experience, I think that peace in North Korea has two dimensions. The first is a dimension that was mentioned by both of you, is the establishment of a righteous social system under SDG 16. And the second dimension relates to bringing peace on the Korean Peninsula and in the Northeast Asian region by improving relations between North Korea and other countries. So if we were to focus on this second part, I think that we need to remember that peace on the Korean Peninsula, peace in Northeast Asia is the terminology that we use, not peace in North Korea. That means that peace for North Korea, that is the P pillar, is connected not only with North Korea but also with South Korea and also the neighboring countries. So it takes more than governments to achieve that. And if we were to deliver outcomes with the second dimension of P, that can be linked to SDG 16 by improving North Korea's internal system in the long run. And of course, to do that, North Korea must come back to the negotiations as soon as possible, and much needs to be changed. But I think the international community should help North Korea be a member, a full-fledged member of the international community. And I think the starting point for HDP discussion is lies in the motto of SDG, leave no one behind. And I think this idea can be expanded to leave no country behind. And I believe that North Korea should be included in such a country. Of course, the road to achieving that will be bumpy, which is why it requires a very creative thinking and outside-the-box thinking. Thank you very much for your comments. You talked about collaboration with North Korea, and you talked about the role of the private sector, which should play a bigger role in providing assistance to North Korea. We have been in a stalemate for the past 3 years. So how can we break through this stalemate is a question that we need to ponder. And Lee Jae-jung talked about the limitations that we face, and to achieve cooperation in its true sense, then we first need to bring peace on the peninsula and to improve the inter-Korean relations to achieve HDP. at the end of the day.
받는 곳이죠.
So most of the time when we talk about development, we talk about recipient ownership and accountability of the donor. But what Lee Jae-jung said, well, North Korea's ownership is too strong, and at the same time, the donor countries, have too much to say. So it seems like a power struggle between the donors and the recipient, and that's what causes conflict.
우리 두 번째 토론이 저 멀리 스위스에 계신데 연결돼
So
있습니까?
do we have the next discussant with us?
화면 정지돼 있는데 말 들리세요?
Hi.
아, 예, 잘 들리시면 제가 뭐 소개
If you
나중에 하고
can
우리 캐시
hear
선생 발표
us,
10분
then
듣도록
we will
하겠습니다.
give you 10 minutes for your discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning from Switzerland, and thank you for inviting me to participate at this Korea Global Forum. Let me start with my experience in working in North Korea. As said before, international emergency relief to North Korea started in 1995 at a time when the country was facing a terrible famine. My first trip to North Korea was in spring 1995, my most recent one in December 2019. In total, I've made more than 70 visits to North Korea, in addition to my time living there, the 5 years while I was heading the office of the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, and that was between 2006 and 2011. At that time, in fact, our work focused on development cooperation. We had projects in sustainable agriculture to address food insecurities. We did income generation to improve people's livelihoods and capacity development to contribute to individual and institutional learning. At Corate Limited, the organization I established in Hong Kong in 2015, we primarily support people with disabilities and children in institutions. How do I see the present needs and priorities in North Korea? What are the issues today? It's chronic food insecurity, inadequate health care, and poor access to water and sanitation services. And then frequent natural disasters add to people's vulnerabilities in that nation. It is also crucial to see how we can address the COVID-19 pandemic by providing and distributing COVID-19 vaccines. With the extreme measures taken by the North Korean government as a result of the pandemic, the overall deteriorating situation in the country has made life for ordinary citizens even more difficult. To provide humanitarian aid and to support disaster preparedness and prevention efforts remain musts. Efforts to link relief, rehabilitation, and development, the LRRD concept, should continue. This approach can and does work in the DPRK. It is also important to keep in mind that the local people, the aid recipients, will not and cannot differentiate between the classifications used in the international aid world. For them, what counts is receiving help that reduces their daily struggle for survival. Confidence building measures and capacity building efforts are other crucial aspects which should be built into assistance projects and programs for North Korea. Now to the HDP or Triple Nexus and the situation on the ground. In fact, this new initiative was launched at the first ever World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul in 2016. The focus is on improving cooperation and collaboration between the three key areas of humanitarian, development, and peace-building aid, thus the HDP or the Triple Nexus. From what I understand about the HDP Nexus, consensus on what the Triple Nexus approach is, as well as how it should be implemented, is lacking. Yet, it is crucial to have a common understanding of what the three pillars of the HDP represent. The H is relatively clear. For the D, I think we would need to listen more to what the North Koreans see as their priorities. And for the P, a clear definition fitting the Korean context is absolutely crucial. In fact, we may need three definitions for P, one for the North, one for the South, and one that merges the two. As Jérôme Sauvage pointed out, the DPR context is not the perfect fit for HDP. Rather, this new concept would need to be introduced by experts in the field with training programs for organizations working in North Korea and also for our North Korean partners. And we need to answer the questions of whether there are good, successful examples of applying the HDP, and if so, whether they are relevant for the situation on the Korean Peninsula. Moreover, because of COVID-19, we also have to take into account that North Korea's borders have been closed since January 2020. Meanwhile, all international aid workers have left the country, and most projects and programs have stopped. I also recently learned that staff members at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other partner agencies have changed. Working with new teams will bring challenges, but hopefully new opportunities as well. What changes would be needed? Change needs to start with funding. Figures from the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, show that official development assistance is shrinking. With an increase in climate-related disasters as well as costly, lengthy conflicts, such as, for example, those in Syria, Yemen, and Afghanistan, emergency needs are growing while funding is simultaneously decreasing. The cake is getting smaller, but HDP needs long-term programming and multi-year funding. In the case of North Korea, funding for humanitarian aid has decreased dramatically over recent years. Getting money for development cooperation under the sanctions is near impossible. And how to address peace-building initiatives on the Korean Peninsula is yet another critical matter for this new concept. Humanitarian, development, and peace actors are asked to conduct their work more holistically. This is easier said than done. The stovepiped way of working, the silos that exist, are hard to combat. It requires, for example, the various government departments to work more closely together and to shift from a sectoral to an integrated approach. That's a huge challenge, especially with the intense competition for funds and other aid inputs. So what's next? Once the borders open, a new needs assessment and a new UN appeal will be crucial, provided, of course, that we aid agencies are allowed to work in North Korea again. As a reminder, it was not long ago that a North Korean researcher said that US humanitarian aid is a sinister political scheme to put pressure on other countries. On a positive note, the DPRK did prepare the report Voluntary National Review on the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Therefore, we need to continue to use and help to improve present UN tools. Is the timing right for introducing this new HDP approach, especially since we might soon have to deal with a new humanitarian crisis? Hungry people want and need food first, and they need it fast. With the HDP Nexus, the involvement of civil society and local NGOs is crucial, but presently very difficult in the DPRK context. On the other hand, state actors might have to plan, state actors may have to play an even more central role in the planning and implementation of the HDP projects and programs. Might there be a risk that the humanitarian space could continue to shrink even further? Well, in terms of the agenda of the HDP Nexus, and when I see the situation on the ground in North Korea, I in fact have more questions than answers. But whatever we do, the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence are fundamental to all humanitarian actions. We have to stay involved in North Korea, reduce suffering, and improve the well-being of the country's people. I worry greatly that with all the problems in other parts of the world, the plight of the North Korean people will be forgotten. Thank you.
예, 감사합니다, 제시. 예. 그
Thank
앞에서도 우리 제시 선생이 소개했듯이 95년도부터
from
평양을 북한을
1995, she
방문하셨잖아요.
had visited North
우리
Korea
NGO 또 한국이
and
북한 지원이 사실
NGOs in
96년도부터는
Korea
2년 전에 미리 북한에 소위 고난의
started
지원을
providing
앞장서
support in
하셨는데
1996 and 1997, and she was also the Hong Kong Caritas head, and so it's been more than 20 years, and she still tells us that the humanitarian situation in DPRK is difficult, and she talked about the various difficulties in DPRK, and under the sanction situation there needs to be stable funding, but this is not easy, and the peace on the peninsula, it might be unilateral, so it should not be a unilateral peace. It should be a shared concept of peace, peace from North Korea, South Korea, and the Korean Peninsula. And so we will hear the other discussants, and we ask you to be with us. And this is jokingly, but in the DPRK, they consider Katharina a combination of Mother Teresa and Joan of Arc.
The next discussant is Mr. Jussi Ojala. Are you still here with us? So he is from FinChurch Aid. You have 10 minutes for the discussion.
Thank you very much, and Anuashmika. First of all, let me thank the organizers of the forum. I think it's a timely effort. Now is the best time to discuss the Korean peace and developments also in the DPRK, and so compliments for organizing this great event. I would also express my gratitude to the speakers, Professor Kim and Mr. Savage, great presentations, and it's a pleasure to comment those. But maybe first a few words about where we are coming from as Finchurch Aid. So FCA is the largest development or aid organization of Finland, working in some of the most vulnerable contexts in the world. Triple Nexus is very much at the DNA of FCA, so very pleased to be here in this session today. In 2018, FCA was requested to start a humanitarian operation in DPRK by the DPRK authorities. And since then, we've conducted 3 assessment missions to the country, and we have identified the operational area where we would work. It's North Hwanghae and also the substance area. And this is about the school feeding in 3 counties in North Hwanghae province, targeting all the primary schools in the counties, meaning some 19,000 children and also teachers. And we have a UN Sanctions Committee exemption for our operations. But on to the presentations. I very much agree with Professor Kim in his comment about the joint Korean VNR. It sounds like a very good initiative and hopefully something that could take place in the time to come. Also, I think I very much agree on the general topic that looking at the convergence of the national and international processes to support the HDP Nexus is a crucial and bears lots of opportunities. And in fact, I agree on so many things on both presentations that maybe I need to focus just on few issues where we can maybe spark some discussions. And the first one maybe that I want to raise is relating to the peace. And Professor Kim was questioning the international abilities to support the peace efforts in DPRK and in the peninsula. And some of the commentators, I think Ms. Zellweger was talking about the 3 Ps, different approaches. And my experience coming from also faith-based organization like FCA and having had the privilege to cooperate with many of the faith actors is that actually faith actors have a remarkable history and role in the discussions and dialogue on peace, not only in DPRK, but then in the peninsula as a whole. So I really don't think that peace is lost in the discussion, but actually there might be many things that other actors could learn from the faith actors in the time span, for example. Look at how patient efforts that the faith actors have been putting into the peace building front, just to name something. And furthermore, if I'm zooming into DPRK and knowing that some of the faith actors, how they work, they work in hospitals, for example, or prior to COVID, but actually what they aim to do in their work is to support peace. And it is, there might be some reasoning to do from the work at DPRK hospitals to the Korean Peninsula peace. But I think you can bridge the gaps between the different Ps, like Ms. Zellweger was pointing out. And then again, the faith actors actually could be a good example of some of the tools that can be applied. The ownership issue is something that came up in many presentations, and I would just like to underline this a bit more. So if you look at Finchurch Aid, we were invited to the country by the DPRK authorities, and actually there's no other way. So we cannot force humanitarian, we cannot force development work, or we cannot force the peace building work. There needs to be a pull towards this. And what I would like to point out that there might be also other frameworks to look in the ownership front, or maybe I would talk about co-ownership. and the opportunities that these can provide when thinking also about the HDP Nexus. So if you look at, again, my own organization, Finchurch Aid, so of course we come with a package of values. We come with, for example, the humanitarian principles, we come with the global commitment to SDGs, to human rights, and also the faith values. And a case in point is our history. In 2010, actually, we engaged first time with the discussions on the DPRK authorities, and then we couldn't agree on the humanitarian principles. So we couldn't start our operations. But then again, in 2018, this was not an issue. The humanitarian principles were agreed clearly as the basis for the work. So I think there are some of these issues where the ownership can be somehow shared. To the presentation of Mr. Savage, first I would perhaps like to compliment of the role of the UN, knowing that you are not longer with the UN, but our history in working with the UN. So it's been quite amazing actually to work with the UN country team and agencies like UNICEF and WFP and FAO. So it's really a tight community and lots of good information sharing on the ground, and this is quite unprecedented, I think, worldwide. So many things are working very well there. The second general aspect on the UN is I remember reading the UN strategic framework, which I understand you, Mr. Savage, have a big role, and about the rights-based approach in there, how clearly it's written to the document, and obviously, because it's a joint document with the DPRK authorities, so it's very much shared, and it's really allows opportunities to work further also on the HDP Nexus front. On the issue of the fragile state, it's an interesting discussion, I feel, and timely in a way, because you remember a New Deal, the framework to address fragile states was agreed 10 years ago in Busan, and I very much agree that DPRK contains features of fragile state or vulnerability, including the climate-related. But then again, I would argue that the DPRK actually has some of the strongest states on this planet, and rather it's the non-state part of the society that could be stronger and more engaged. And then maybe the question for us as international community is also to seek a people-centric approach. That yes, we have in our mandates to support the governments. But actually, it's about the accountability of the governments towards their people. So how can we be more people-centric in the approach when we look at the DPRK's vulnerabilities? On the issue, just an anecdote on the VNRs, not yet at international level, I tend to agree, but then again, it relates to the aspect of the fragile or strong state of DPRK. So I think DPRK has this ability to mainstream policies like maybe no other country in the world. But then again, it's about the implementation, that even if you would have the 100% of the policies in place, is the country able to implement then those, and how can we best support them? Finally, I would maybe comment on the raising the COVID-19 situation, and we at FCA have been extremely concerned about the COVID-19 and the lacking humanitarian access and the situation on ground, and also the time span, how long it takes to eventually then mobilize the humanitarian assistance. So definitely these are questions that relate to the H, and they relate to the D and also to the P. And of course, the discussion about the vaccines is something that it would be good to hear views also from the participants, that how can we better support the humanitarian access? How can we encourage, find solutions for DPRK to open its borders also for humanitarian access? Thank you so much.
예, 저 멀리. 예.
Yes, thank you very much. I think you connected from Helsinki, Finland. I think it's about 8 a.m. in the morning, so thank you very much for joining us early in the morning. We have 20 minutes left. We have one more discussant. So we have with us Professor Ichi-san. But before that, I would like to wrap up what Juicy said about building trust and co-development programs between the two Koreas. Next, moving on to Professor Ichi-san from Kyunghee University. She served at Stanford University as well as World Bank. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm Ji-sun Lee, as was introduced. It's a pleasure to be participating in the Korea Global Forum for Peace, and it was an honor to hear the two wonderful presentations. Today we are talking about HDP and how can we apply the HDP Nexus in the DPRK, and I think this dialogue itself is meaningful. Of course, there were some comments on the limitations and difficulties of applying HDP in the DPRK. However, if Korea and international society tries to engage DPRK more, discussions on HDP and the HDP itself can be an important tool because there are many tools and approaches, and HDP can become an important tool and approach in engaging North Korea. As Professor Kim stated, HDP has not matured. It is not a mature concept yet. It is not fully developed yet, but there are theories and some cases found in international society, and if this can be applied to the DPRK, then it will be meaningful, I believe. The existing HDP approach, instead of applying that directly to DPRK, we need to find ways to utilize it in the context of the DPRK. And while listening to the presentation and the discussants, I came up with a couple of thoughts, ideas. And the first one is, how should we view DPRK? That's the first thing. I am a researcher linking Africa and DPRK together. I know that Africa and DPRK are different, but they have many similarities too. Jerome Sauvage, in the beginning of his presentation, mentioned that DPRK is different from a failed state in Africa, and they don't have internal conflicts. Therefore, it is not a perfect fit for HDP. He stated that in the beginning, and I agree to that. However, and the failed state in Africa and DPRK, it is very different in the influence of the government. DPRK has a different context because they do have control, but if you look at the result, DPRK government cannot provide, is having difficulty in providing to the needs of its people. They have food shortages, and there is low development, and the basic needs are not being met. So in that aspect, I was thinking, would it be impossible to consider them a failed state? And on the peace definition, how are we going to perceive DPRK? DPRK internally, they don't have armed conflicts internally, and they don't have a lot of violence. That's the stark conflict and violence and to refugees. But we do see some military provocations which have led to sanctions against DPRK. And due to such sanctions, it is becoming a stumbling block and hindrance in its development. And it's also becoming a hindrance in providing aid and assistance to that country. So peace, it's true that there isn't conflict internally, internally, but the peace situation, it is linked with the development and humanitarian situation in DPRK. So the peace, the HDP model, I think that it enables us to expand the concept of HDP. And if we look at peace in a more broader concept, DPRK can be a case that triggers dialogue on HDP Nexus. And secondly, before I listened to the presentations today, I thought of HDP in a skeptical light. But I really felt that there is possibility to use HDP, that there is a lot of possibility there. Still, it feels a little bit complicated and a bit abstract. That is because internationally, HDP, we don't have any clear success stories yet. And when looking at the Afghan situation, there was a lot of investment in HDP, yet it has turned out to be a failure. So we shouldn't just look at DPRK. In order to look at DPRK, we need to find a context similar to DPRK and look at the HDP interaction and research into HDP being implemented in other similar countries and contexts. And if we build up the research, then HDP can become a meaningful tool in approaching DPRK. And lastly, I want to talk about in the utilization of DPRK, we have to understand the North Korea's situation, their position. We shouldn't just say that it's a good thing, therefore you should apply it. We need the cooperation and the partnership of DPRK. Therefore, instead of trying to apply it unilaterally, we should think about and understand how DPRK is understanding HDP. In July, DPRK submitted the VNR, and so people understand that they have turned more positive in their attitude to international standards and norms, and that is a positive thing. But if you look at how they have internalized SDGs, it is different from HDP thought of internationally, and what is thought by the DPRK is different. It was mentioned in the presentation. In particular, SDG 16, it is about governance, peace, justice, and if you go into the indicators, it is human security. So there are human security sub-targets under that goal, Goal 16. And DPRK has internalized this, and they are talking about the strengthening of their socialist community. And so they are not perceiving it as a individual human security, but they are thinking of it more of a system. In their system. So the SDG defined internationally and the SDG defined or interpreted by DPRK is different. The direction is different. So we have to be aware of such differences. We shouldn't just overlook it. We need to understand the differences, and we need to think about ways to narrow down the differences or ways to overcome it. Thank you.
예, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for the comment.
행사장이 또 뒤에 연이은 행사가 있습니다.
So we have a back-to-back session. So I think we will have to wrap up within 5 minutes. So Professor Kim and Jerome, you each have 2 minutes to provide answers. So I think we can sum it up to 2 questions. First of all, so now in 2017, now they cannot visit North Korea since 2017, and NGOs cannot, INGOs cannot visit North Korea. So there are many people who say, then INGOs, are they disbanded? And what's their plan for future initiatives towards North Korea? And next to Professor Kim, so we have HDNP, but Now
역으로
it
말하면
looks
북한의
like
비핵화와
they
비핵화했다는
have
체제인데
different weights.
선행돼야지
So
인도
economic
지원이나
sanctions
개발에
should
대한
first
준비가
be
돼야 되는 거
lifted
아니냐.
for peace to be brought about on the Korean Peninsula.
어긋나는 거 아니냐. 그런 점에서
So in that
북한만이
sense,
소위 말하는
maybe
제재
North
문제, 비핵화에
Korea,
따른 그 HDP 넥서스에 좀 예외가 될 수 있는 뭐
it
그런
may be
가능한
an exception to
맞는
HDP
문제인가라는
Nexus.
문제를 했었고요. 마지막 질문 그렇습니다.
And the next
저도 정확히
question
이해하기는
is
어렵습니다만
this.
HDP 넥서스 이해에
So,
대해서는
to understand
실제적으로
HDP
행자가 중요하다고
Nexus, I
생각하는데
believe that the agents
프로젝트의 성격과
need to play
행자 중에
an
무엇이 더
important
중요한
role.
것인가
But
말씀하셨는데
what is exactly the role of the agents? Do you understand the question, Professor Kim? So I will each give you 1 minute and 30 seconds, including concluding remarks.
네,
Professor
네
Kim?
분의
Yes.
커멘테이터에서 주신 코멘트 굉장히
So thank you very much for your
제가
comments,
답변을 다 드리고 싶은데도 불구하고 시간이 많지
discussants.
않아서
But since I'm pressed for time,
모더레이터께서
I would like to
질문에
give you a brief
정부에서
answer
드리면서 연결이 되면 다른
on the
코멘트도
questions
연결되겠습니다.
posed
첫
by the
번째가
moderator. The first was about HDP Nexus. Should it be conducted in a simultaneous manner or one after the other? Well, from what I understand, HDP is a flexible concept. So depending on the context and the circumstances, they can use in silo, they can move in silo, or they can be connected. So I think there was a question about agents and the role of the agents. So it really depends on the purpose of the agents. So what do they want to achieve with HDP? Well, there was one who mentioned co-ownership. I think that all the different concepts are related here because the concept itself of HDP is very intertwined and complex. So I cannot say for sure that it has to move separately or not. It can be both. So let's connect P to D, let's connect P to H. So well, development can only take place with peace, and peace can only take place with development. That's what Kofi Annan said. And so we have to connect all the different pillars. And under Brentwood system and the UN system, we have to be aligned, and that is what led to the report in April 2018 to discuss peace and humanitarian assistance as well as development. So I cannot, it takes more than just 2 minutes to talk about that. Anyway, we need an integrated approach when dealing with HDP. I think one of the commentators said this, but holistic approach or integrated approach is something that is being discussed within the UN. So is it P or is it D? Is it H? No, let's not look at those three concepts separately. Let's combine them together. It can be agent, it can be programs, it can be projects. So I think it was back in 2006, Koika's program to mine program in Vietnam, and then they scaled up the project and created a peace building project in the village. And then if we were to move on from that, it will lead to agriculture. So removal from landmine will lead to agricultural development. So it's a long-term development, and it's rather a project than agent-based type of programs. So social programs are being conducted, and I think we will soon have a checklist soon. So thank you very much. Now, Jerome?
I would simply say that the COVID-19 crisis is the current issue of the day. There will be a visit eventually. The NGOs around the world that are concerned and working on North Korea continue to work, even though they're not physically present. And secondly, there will be a visit, and that will be the time for us to see what is the situation, the real situation on the ground. And from there, we'll be able to develop our programs using all the tools, humanitarian and development, and like the FinAid representative says, with peace in mind. Thank you very much.
예, 감사합니다.
Yes,
조만간
thank you
우리
very much for that
제롬
closing
선생하고
remark. I hope
보통
to
호텔에서
meet you soon, Jerome, and enjoy steak. And I hope that you can visit Korea soon, Katarina too. So we tried to redefine HDP Nexus and devise our way forward in relating HDP Nexus with North Korea. I ask for your participation and support in connecting these different concepts to bring peace on the Korean Peninsula. So of course, peace in Korea can mean so many things to many people. Will we be able to stabilize the North Korean regime and bring peace on the Korean Peninsula? Well, once we have the peace agreement in place, will we truly enjoy peace? Well, many people say that, whether we live in North or South, it doesn't really matter. The location doesn't matter. It's about having the same dreams and having the same goals and sharing the same emotions, and really making sure that the lives of the North Korean residents improve, and that they can enjoy a flourishing economy and lives. So in that sense, NGOs in Korea should work harder, and I look forward to closer cooperation between Korean and international NGOs. And I hope that South North Korea Exchange and Cooperation Support Association will host more discussions like this one. Thank you very much for joining us today. Good night, good afternoon, good morning, Jerome, Katarina, and Juicy. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.